advantages of using a cognitive processing perspective. Well, I've already talked to you about, social justice. Now, I don't want to get too into the weeds, so to speak, about test bias. Because if you study the research on test bias, many people, I think, will, I'm going to say correctly here, but it's going to be correctly with a footnote coming, correctly say their test doesn't have test bias. If you look at things like item difficulties, item gradients, reliabilities across race and ethnic, factor invariance, and all that kind of stuff. But here's the thing. If you read the standards for educational psychological testing, they make it very clear that if a person has had limited opportunity to learn the content of an intelligence test, that test may be considered unfair to penalize the students for not knowing the answers, even if the norming data do not demonstrate test bias. This is very important. I went to a National Association of Gifted Children's conference last year and listened to a learned school psychologist say that IQ tests have no bias, but he left out this part. And I don't think that's right, because this is the important part. In other words, the impact that it has. Now, neurocognitive processes, past theory, for example, that do not rely on knowledge are much preferred because they measure thinking rather than knowing, and that gets around this problem of not knowing the content of the intelligence test. So let's look and see what we have here. So here are just 3 studies to give you an idea. I'm not just making this stuff up. We've published on this for a long time. This study, the first one, Hispanic and non-Hispanic differences are very small on the CAS. When Dr. Otero and I studied the CAS when given in English or in Spanish, we found out that you get the same scores whether you give it in English or Spanish, and most importantly, over 90% of the time, you get the same conclusion of whether or not the child has a weakness or a strength whether you give it in English or Spanish. So your interpretations are going to be the same regardless of what language you give it in. This is really important because that's the end result, right? That's the most important part of what we do is we say, here's what I found, here's what it means. So that's a big piece. But trying to get rid of this thing here. This summary of research here from our Essentials book also helps us get the big picture on what's going on. Now, just so a little bit of explanation here. In parentheses is really the description of the methodology. So like if you look at the SB4 matched samples, that means someone went and got a black kid and a white kid, matched them on demographics, and then did the comparison and found a 13 points difference. The WISC-V, a 12-point difference. And then when you look at normative sample, that means the groups weren't matched, they were matched to the normative characteristics. And then you can have statistical controls, which try to do essentially matching, but mathematically. And you see you have everything from 8 to 13 points. Now, when you look at, for example, the KVC, actually this matched study, this is the KVC study that I did many years ago. I think it was the only person to actually do a black-white study on the KVC. And you see the differences there. And then you see the CAS and the CAS2, and you see what you get. When you take out the measurement of intelligence, knowledge, and when you measure processing, brain-based conceptualization, it makes a difference. It is more socially just. Let's go another step. This is a really important court case that occurred in Elgin, Illinois. And this study is about gifted, but I think it has tremendous implications for what we do. You don't need to read all this stuff. I'm just going to tell you what's going on. In this school district, 43% of the kids are Hispanic in the district. 3% of the kids in gifted are Hispanic. Obviously, something's wrong. The Judge Gettleman, actually explicitly stated that after looking at all the evidence, he concluded that the district intentionally discriminated against Hispanic students. That's really bad, obviously. So how did all this happen? Well, they used verbal and math tests to screen for gifted, and they also used, interestingly, my Naglieri nonverbal ability test. But here's what they did. They required everybody to have really high verbal and math test scores from tests like the COGAT and achievement tests. So they effectively screened out the Hispanic kids, and that's why the judge ruled that they discriminated against them. Had they used measures that did not require the knowledge of English and achievement, which of course a nonverbal test provides, the picture would have been very different. This has implications for us because we use verbal and math test items all the time to decide how smart kids are. That's a problem. So I think the lack of a clear distinction between ability and achievement tests corrupt the very concept of intelligence. And we're hurting kids. And I don't want to see us do that. We really need to stop, because a child who hasn't had the opportunity to learn will be at a disadvantage. And you will think they're less smart than they really are. That's just not right. I have a paper where I've actually shown this to be the case. Paper published in the American Journal of Mental Retardation in 2001 with a colleague of mine, Johannes Royan. In this particular study, we had white and black kids who were given the WISC and the cognitive assessment system. And what we found was that the full scale scores for the cognitive assessment system for the white kids were the same as the WISC scores. So white kids, the same WISC full scale as CAS, not for the black kids. The black kids had lower verbal scores and lower full scales on the WISC, and the CAS scores were higher. Clearly what was happening here was because the black kids didn't have the educational opportunity, they didn't have the high enough verbal scores, and they wound up being identified as for classes for children, which we called at that time mentally retarded. That's wrong. That's a social injustice. Now, let's talk about the advantages, and now this will bring me to the ADHD. Advantages as it relates to SLD eligibility determination. So I'm going to use this case. This is one of Tulio's cases. This is not really the boy Alejandro, just a nice picture of a boy. So this is a young man who wasn't doing well in school and was evaluated, and here are his WISC-IV scores. When you look at these data, the KT and the WISC-IV, it's very reasonable to say he's doing the best he can. He's not really that smart. It's kind of on some borderline maybe, but his achievement scores are like his cognitive scores. He's a nice kid, blah, blah, blah. You know what? That's not true. He has a 67 standard score on the attention scale on the CAS, and an 84 on the successive processing, but he's got really average simultaneous and planning scores. So all of a sudden, the picture of the student changes. By the way, in this case, the full scale is completely worthless. I wouldn't even report it because it's just misleading. But look, this is a different picture of the same boy. And it takes us in a very different direction. The test you choose has a profound impact on what you learn about a student, and ultimately a profound impact on the student's life. We have so many examples like this in our book and in our presentations. It happens all the time. Now, he's not a slow learner, as I would have said many years ago. He actually has a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes, which is the basis of a learning disability. Remember, SLD is a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes, manifests itself as an imperfect ability, blah, 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 all the academic stuff, right? So here's how it looks. If you use the discrepancy consistency method that I've been advocating for, which you could use this on any ability test, but I mean, obviously, I think it should be used with a cognitive processing measure. But basically what you get is, let's just go back and look at Alejandro. Here's what you get. You get significant discrepancy between his planning and simultaneous and his attention and successive scores. You get a traditional discrepancy, good ability, bad achievement. But here's the most important of all of these, consistency. This tells you why the student fails. This tells you why. And that's what we need to know if we want to build any kind of intervention. You can get these analyzers on my website that does all the math, fills the triangle and all that. They're all for free on my website if you're interested in that. But let's look at profiles now. This brings us to ADHD. So, if I'm suggesting to you that you should use a profile approach for SLD determination, it's fair to say, well, do you get profiles on any of the tests that we have? And I've asked this question a couple of different times and done several different analyses of the data that we have, and I'm going to show them to you in one big spot. So if you look at WISC-V and WISC-IV for children with ADHD, everything's above average. If you look at WJ, everything's above 90. Look at the KBC, everything's above 90. You look at the CAS, everything's above 90 except planning. Planning is executive function, frontal lobe. That fits perfectly with our conceptualization of ADHD as an executive function failure. But how does this differ from SLD? Well, this is the research on WISC-V and WISC-IV for children with specific reading decoding failure. A little low on working memory, but not that much. WJ profile, not much happening there. KBC, nothing happening there. But look at the CAS. Specifically low on successive processing makes perfect sense. These children who can't do reading decoding, can't tie their shoes, can't remember the combination to their lockers, oftentimes have speech articulation problems. It's all about sequencing. That's a true dyslexia. But what's really scary is when you look at these profiles over each one, well, the WJ, it doesn't differentiate between the two hardly at all. So that's your, a good approximation of CHC, which is scary because we really need to have more evidence there. You get this weird stuff with the WISC. The only thing that's a little low is working memory, but that would make some sense because digits stand forward. You could think of that as involving successive processing, but it's so confounded by other things. That's why it's not so low. And the KBC, I don't understand. So we do get predictable differences. And you can read my profile analysis study, and there's a bunch of other studies done on profile analysis by Achilles Bartos and his students. And then just a little bit on instructional guidance. of all my colleagues, and I have tremendous respect for all of my colleagues in the assessment field. You know, I can disagree with people, but I have respect for all of them without exception. And honestly, I mean that. But just to put things in context, I'm the only one who's actually ever done intervention research. I'm the only one who's actually produced a book of interventions that's keyed to the past theory. Because we can do that. It's really easy. This book has intervention handouts that you can give, not a copyright problem. You give to parents, teachers, and students themselves so that they can better impact the students' learning. And I don't have time to really go into all of these, but I'm going to show you one study and then I'll be ready to stop. This is really the best of the studies in a lot of ways, which is a randomized control study, which is very important because we can say the methodology caused the outcome. And in this study, we looked at teaching students, or encouraging students to be more strategic about what they do. I call it planning facilitation in my Helping Children Learn book. That's the intervention. And we compared the cognitive instruction to additional math instruction. And when we looked at pre-post scores on math worksheets, which were based on the curriculum that the students had already been taught, we see the students who got planning facilitation improved dramatically. When we looked at light numerical operations, the students who were taught to think improved more than the children who got more instruction. Same thing for math fluency. And a year later, we went back and found that the experimental group was still better than the control group. A year later, we never even were in the school over that interval of time. So I encourage you can read this paper, it's on my website, read the planning facilitation method. Again, in my book and other places, we've been able to show that cognition predicts response to intervention. That's what this study and all the other studies I've done clearly shows. Cognition predicts response to intervention. Here are a bunch of other studies that you can look at.